I'm best known for a book subtitled "A Nation-Building State Changes Its Mind." In other words, the state gives up on the nation and decides to build the economy instead. In the wake of a quarter of a century of root and branch neoliberal economic re-engineering of a whole society, I've been asked to reflect on the prospects for a renewal of nation building today. A few comments at the outset will save time. We Australians do have a charter myth. It's somewhat unique. Australia is a Benthamite society with a very secular, unromantic and down-to-earth utilitarian idea of itself. For Brits today, evocations of national identity will play on our British heritage. Americans will use well-developed moral vocabularies to talk about their founding rights and freedoms. Old European nations evoke their own notions of national destiny with appeals to myths of origin, to communities of descent, and to millenarian and heroic histories. Here in Australia, we push the Aborigines aside and quickly set about constructing a nation that was geared to something like the delivery of the greatest good to the greatest number. Our foundation population was born modern, committed to Enlightenment ideas of progress, and steeped in the view that society could be improved through the application of reason and industry. This was never a romantic and giddy metaphysic, but it did carry its own kind of unifying symbolism. Progress understood as security, as freedom from war and strife, and above all as prosperity for all is or was our own quasi-utopian ideal. It shaped our national imagination, and right up until the early 1980s, it served to sustain and integrate what was then a centre two-party political consensus and a full gamut of public policies aimed at building a still new nation. To catch the flavour and the meaning, think of those brochures we used to attract migrants to Australia in the 1940s and 1950s. I first came over them in Paris, made my eyes pop. All the key bits of our story are there. Massive infrastructure developments, the Snowy Mountains scheme and the like, a relaxed lifestyle, the absence of old class antagonisms, vistas of new affordable suburban dwellings, free education for all, a vast sunny continent with unlimited potential offering improving quality of life for all. This was the Australian post-war dream. Neoliberalism, globalisation, or economic rationalism, we all understand this is the same thing, don't we, has imposed its own strictures on states and governments everywhere. But are we the only society that has surrendered its charter myths and its images of its own future to the dull compulsions of the market? Or could it be that there is once again a potential for a positive, constructive re-emergence of nation-building governance? That upward ramp of Bruce Petty, though. Is there a potential once again to stop the tail from wagging the dog and to draw the markets into the service of the people? Perhaps the time is right for such questions. In Europe, globalisation tends to subsume the idea of national purpose into the larger framework of the European economic community. Here, by contrast, we find ourselves thrown onto our own resources. We're not threatened with any national emergency or with belligerent neighbours. Notwithstanding the plight of Aboriginal Australia, we have no serious ethnic, religious or social divisions. A strong national economy, sustained by a resource boom, offers the best of prospects in a long time for mid to long-term economic stability. The Treasury is, as I heard one senior official recently say in public, if the Pollies had heard him, he'd be dead meat by now, quote, "awash with money, we hardly know what to do with it." So, what potential might there be for nation building to wake from 25 years of amnesia? To answer that question, I want to look at the potentials for nation building from three viewpoints: national politics, national administration, and national culture. I hope to persuade you that the prospects for a resumption of constructive nation building are on balance very promising indeed. So first, national politics. There are 4 points. First, we should note that we've grown accustomed to radicalism. The Whitlam government was a radical government. The Fraser government was not, but the Hawke and Keating governments were radical in much the same way that 4 Howard governments have been. As with Thatcher in Britain, radical governments want to crash through and, if necessary, destroy existing institutions to get their way and to overcome what the reformers love to call institutional inertia. How times have changed. Libertarian, free market, laissez-faire economics, economic reform, structural change, economic rationalism, call it what you will, was developed in the 1970s and early 1980s and pressed upon the developed trilateral nations of North America, Western Europe and Japan as a remedy for what was touted as a general systemic problem. These democracies were held to be drifting, rudderless, in the grip of a new class of self-serving drones, paralysed by bureaucracy and weighed down with an overload of mutually contradictory decisions. In the words of the 1975 report to the Trilateral Commission, where it all started, the problem was that these democracies had become ungovernable. My point is that, at least in its own terms, crash-through reform has done its job with a vengeance. Over a quarter of a century, 2 ruling parties, the ALP and the Coalition, and their ministers, have demonstrated dramatically that they can call up massive reserves of organised power to transform a whole nation's society. Secondly, contemporary politics and contemporary politicians have entirely changed. In a recent article, Bob Brown, leader of the Greens, ventured the view that most politicians still come to this demanding and thankless work because they want to make a difference. Yes, maybe, but if we put their values to one side for a moment, I think we can see the result of a generational transformation in our career politicians, at least at the national level. The terrible work of intra-party politics, of committee work, of selling the government's or the opposition's line on a whole range of policies weighs so heavily on these overworked people that they scarcely think about their constituents, except at election time when they feel a little more vulnerable. The branch party members have vanished, but there's something more. Politicians no longer recognise themselves or understand what they do in received notions of million representative democracy and popular sovereignty. Collectively, at least, as members of a party, an opposition, or a government, they no longer believe that sovereignty lies with the people. It's a momentous change. That notion has been stood on its head. For them, professional, grown-up, big league politics is about aggregating and managing big interests. For the most part, they no longer believe that it is their duty to obey public opinion, but rather that it is their job, with the help of an army of media advisors and spin doctors, I think the Howard government had 200 of them, to bend, cajole and manage the public into an acceptance of whatever the system can deliver, within whatever parameters are set by big interests operating in an increasingly globalised economy. Grassroots, face-to-face, town hall and party branch democracy of the post-war and later Whitlam years are now eclipsed as a motive force for big politics. Political communication is done through the media. My point then is that nation building could only make sense to this generation of professional politicians as a tightly managed, top-down process. Rudd is a technocrat. The Times favour technocrats. Thirdly, for a quarter of a century, both major parties have been wedded to a politics that sits in outright contradiction with our national history. Our tradition is one in which the state led and private capital followed, mostly in close partnership. Yet from about the time of Prime Minister Hawke's trilogy commitment of 1984, we've been subject to an ever more aggressively applied opposite model that John Braithwaite so exquisitely labelled the hydraulic model. It proceeds from the same libertarian American ideology, it's not Australian, that drives neoliberal free market economic reform and assumes that to have strong markets, you must have weak states. Our two major parties seem committed to this renunciation of our past with the application of policies that are deeply averse to public spending and which assume, in the face of all the contrary evidence, that the state sector is a national burden, a hindrance to development, and that a dollar spent in the private economy is a productive dollar and worth more than a dollar spent in the public sector. Our politicians do not wish to recognise that the libertarian Anglophone variant of modern capitalism, because there are at least 5 versions of modern capitalism, that the Anglophone and American version of modern capitalism shows up even on conventional economic criteria of comparative economic performance very badly. I can think of no other developed nation whose politicians, ours, have so completely abandoned their institutional inheritance to a foreign ideology. Fourth, both major parties now believe that they must accede to the demands of a corporate business sector that operates in a changed relationship to the nation. Now faced with a globalised multinational corporate sector, politicians no longer believe that they can do much to moderate the raw elements of the broader economic dispensation within which people must live their lives. The comparative evidence shows so clearly that different nations adapt to the same global economic forces in very different ways, in many cases with strongly positive outcomes for their national populations. Think of the Netherlands or West Germany, the Nordic countries. Yet our politicians, under the witch's spell of neoliberal economic orthodoxy, have decided that governments of either side must first of all serve a Business Council of Australia, and that's the chief executive officers of the top 100 corporations, that always makes the same demands, namely, for a predictable environment for investment, which is fair enough, I think, for the minimum attainable price for labour, not fair, and for the minimum attainable level of corporate taxation, again, not fair. The national accounts tell the story. Over the 27 years from 1980 to the year 2007, the total wages share of the national economy has fallen from 60% to 53%, as the profit share has risen from 17% to 27%. These are huge redistributions. The government's share has stayed at about the same low level, and the trend continues. So much for battlers and working families. The point is that nation building in any form that costs a lot of money, the Republic, Mabo, and so far the Apology, haven't cost any money, cannot happen unless the Business Council will allow it to happen. Well, through this window into national politics, we see mixed prospects for a resumption of constructive nation building. On the one hand, we have clear evidence that national governments can govern strongly and effectively. On the other side, we see that all this was done in the name of neoliberal economic restructuring of a whole nation society, and that just this unbending ideology governs the government. will the Rudd government try to loosen these strictures? Could our newfound strengths then be used over the longer term to rebuild our infrastructure and to draw the markets and some big corporate interests into the service of a more progressive and inclusive future for the nation? Is that what the Rudd government will try to do? We still don't know. Second perspective, the Canberra bureaucracy and the federal structure. Again, 4 points. 1, the top Canberra public service has turned its back on nation building. Now this is so important because we've known since the early 1970s that in developed nations, top public servants are typically, with their ministers, the co-authors or even the originators of national politics, national policy, sorry. But now the neoliberal economic rationalists dominate Canberra. We're a light year away from the Coombs 1976 Royal Commission on Government Administration, which recommended that Treasury should be stripped of much of its power and that economic policy making be largely devolved to the line or spending departments so that it could be more closely geared to the real coalface economic and social priorities of nation building. Quickly, from the Hawke-Keating years, the Public Service Board lost its independence. The very idea of a courier service charged with giving advice without fear or favour was put to the sword as top public servants were brought to heel, put on short-term contracts and told to perform and do the minister's bidding or lose their performance pay and all hopes for advancement. As they say, the rest is history. The post-war generation of committed centrists and progressively minded improvers and nation builders with long time horizons were overwhelmed in an ideological restructuring, a political re-education, if you prefer, of the top federal public service. In 1992, Coombs himself, a former governor of the Reserve Bank, an economist, was not shy in venturing the judgment that, I quote, the intellectual and moral basis of Australian society has been corrupted, and the driving force behind these reforms is a view of the economy as a machine independent of social purposes. Today, public policy is set within an ideological mould that is, at least in principle, averse to public expenditure, to public borrowing, to what we used to call the mixed economy, to planning per se, and to the deployment of state power to steer the national economy into any kind of mid and long-term nation building initiatives. After 20 and some years of these reforms, Australia now has a system of public expenditure that is averse to capacity building and for which, quote John Wanner, budget rationing rather than budget maximising has become the Australian creed. This is a culture that is likely to prejudge nation-building initiatives as reckless adventures to shun large publicly funded infrastructure projects and capacity building in whatever form they might appear. Secondly, on the other side of the coin, we have a demonstrably efficient and professional bureaucracy, with the exception of a politically sponsored AWB bribery scam. There is no evidence of corruption. The streamlining of the forward estimates, accrual accounting, new information technologies, and the increasing sophistication of Department of Finance and Administration controls on expenditure have all contributed to huge gains in efficiency of a Canberra public service that is today half the size of 20 years ago. The bureaucracy has proven that it can forecast and control expenditures accurately, that it can respond flexibly to changing funding priorities, and here the jury is out, that it can, perhaps more effectively coordinate policies across and between departments rationally and efficiently. Think of coordinating Aboriginal health, education, coordinating the Northern Territory Initiative across health, Aboriginal affairs, education. We don't know whether you can coordinate it across functions yet. We're getting there. Although the experience of nation building has been long forgotten, the capacity to coordinate major initiatives over time, and perhaps across several departments, is probably much stronger than it ever was before. Thirdly, and we have new tools for nation building. Let me briefly mention three of them. You may be surprised to learn that tax collection from multinational corporations has increased at some 3 times faster than the growth in GDP, and that this is largely the result of new information technologies. Moreover, new IT systems have greatly augmented the capacity of government to plan and monitor programs and initiatives. Another cause of optimism appears when we look past all the shibboleths about deregulation to the real story. True that the deregulation of the financial sector led to profiteering by the banks and contributed to the unsustainable levels of private indebtedness and an artificial inflation of house prices, the partial deregulation of the labour market, and most egregiously work choices, has produced another type of sponsored exploitation. In other areas, though, we see not free-for-all laissez-faire deregulation, but instead the emergence of what we call regulatory capitalism. And it's extending and deepening regulatory supervision across a range of public and private industries with amazing speed. In the interest of creating a more predictable future, business is more often inclined to accept public calls for governments to provide sound, publicly enforceable, safety, prudential, environmental and ethical standards for corporate activity, sometimes. Improved regulation also has the demonstrated potential to turn privatisation into a good news story. For example, it's a big if the government can impose suitable standards for telephony and broadband spectrum usage on a fully privatised telecom, then the revenues from the sales of government equity in such enterprises can be used for other purposes. With other conditions, the same may apply to the leasing of the New South Wales electricity generators. And lastly, it's worth noting that some 25 years ago, we had scarcely heard about accountability or about targeted and performance-based funding. Now we are much more able to make public administration and financial systems deliver on their promises. In short, the available instruments for the delivery of nation building have vastly improved from the days of post-war reconstruction and the later Whitlam governments. Fourthly, and more worrying, are the challenges to nation building that accrue from our creaking federal system. The year 2007 should be remembered as an example of an especially glaring dissociation and imbalance between the state and federal levels of government. On the one side, the 2007 election gives a picture of a national government that is awash with revenues, as our two major political parties were forced into a perverse and ideologically sponsored competition to see which will better squander a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a modern national infrastructure by handing tax revenues back in electoral bribes so that people can use it on plasma televisions. On the other side of this canvas, we see a New South Wales Labor government selling off precious coastal forest land to pay for improvements to a train and public transport system that is in ruins from decades of neglect, incompetent management and chronic underfunding. Similarly, for years we have watched the Queensland and New South Wales governments locked into competition to grant unsustainable water licences to their own upstream water users at levels that are seriously endangering our principal national river system. In contrast, With other federations like Canada, we suffer from a mighty fiscal imbalance between a federal state that collects some 75% of all revenues and a state sector that is still constitutionally responsible for the lion's share of service delivery and public works. My cough hasn't deserted me after all. What is more, in this environment, regional policies that involve still more problematic intergovernment cooperation are virtually impossible. Secondly, we hear many experienced administrators telling us that divided state-federal responsibility for the delivery of services nearly always results in buck passing and failures of coordination. The provision of pharmaceuticals in public hospitals, and most recently the fraught attempts of the federal government to intervene in the Northern Territory Aboriginal policy, are but two examples of these failures. Divided responsibility generally fails, and it greatly impairs our capacity to recover and to mount nation-building initiatives that will now, in this century, mostly cross state jurisdictions and require a concerted whole-of-government approach. For nation-building to resume, we must make the Federation work more effectively. So, in conclusion to this second section, it would seem that in the wake of 20 and more years of neoliberal economic re-engineering of the machinery of government, we have a more technocratic and managerially oriented top federal public service with an ingrained ideological aversion to nation building and a much reduced capacity for delivering fearless and independent advice to ministers. On the other side of the coin, there have been huge gains in efficiency, budget management and coordination. The third viewpoint, our national culture, only about 5 minutes to go. What has happened to our memory of nation building post-war government? How does our longer history of nation building shape the norms and critical standards that we apply to contemporary politics and to our assessments of a 25-year-long experience of economic reform? 4 points again, seems lockstep. We've not given up, firstly, we've not given up our expectations of what good government could achieve. First, there was the floating of the Australian dollar, and then the deregulation of the capital markets, then privatisation, you could all sing if you like, then privatisation, labour market reform, microeconomic reform, user pays, cutting government spending, welfare reform, competition policy, and more labour market reform, work choices. All these reforms were pressed on us with the same unremitting message. Government is a blunt instrument and for the most part the enemy of progress and prosperity. Taxation is a form of theft. We should rid ourselves of the nanny state, expect less of governments, become a shareholder society, and rely instead on the creative energies of private enterprise and free market capitalism. Australians were urged to accept the new doctrine that, quote, economies, markets and money would always, at least in principle, deliver better outcomes than states, governments and the law. Have we bought this message? The evidence shows that yes, we value and want a well-functioning economy, but no, we do not want economic reconsiderations to one-sidedly redefine or restrict the role of government. Take a glimpse at the evidence. The results of the Middle Australia researchers show that an average of about 70% of Middle Australians believe that governments can and should deliver across a broad range of 13 basic functions. I won't list them for you, it'd take too long. We are not and never have been gung-ho American-style libertarians. We have not turned our back on government. Australians have resisted the new doctrines and still expect effective, proactive governments to steer economic development. Hurrah! Secondly, Australia has not accepted institutional reform, that wonderful euphemism. In the midst of economic boom and in the wake of relentless attempts to persuade them to the contrary, Middle Australia respondents believed that the nation was better served by the older post-war 1945 to 1985 institutional order than it is by the newer reformed institutional order that has been foisted on them with economic reform. While not denying the need for change, over half of the respondents believed that the older economic institutions, including industrial awards and national wage fixation, had brought, quote, only benefits or more benefits than harm. And our review of the data from the much larger 2003 Australian ANU survey of social attitudes showed, moreover, that 2/3 of us believe that awards and wages are the best way of paying workers and settling conditions, right? So neoliberalism has not killed the underlying political culture, that's the message. What we see revealed in these several findings are our own preference for an older institutional order that has defined the nation virtually since Federation and which has shown itself to be remarkably resilient even in the face of saturating elite attempts to win credibility and legitimacy for the new neoliberal dispensation. Thirdly, we've clung steadfastly to our inherited belief that states, business and trade unions should work together, collectively, to build a fair, secure and prosperous future. Again, the Middle Australia data accords with the findings of numerous surveys, including the comprehensive Australian electoral studies, showing that nearly 3/4 of us believe that big business has too much power. Why are we shy of saying this? Because we believe it. Interestingly, in the 2005 Australian Survey of Social Attitudes, we hear a huge 76% of respondents agreeing with the proposition that when big business breaks the law, they go unpunished. About 60% of them thought that the federal government is run not for the benefit of the people, but entirely or mostly for the benefit of a few big interests looking out for themselves. The Australian Electoral Survey, again, put the number at 67% in 2004 subscribing to that proposition. The Middle Australia Survey, we're quickly done with this in a second, asked whether respondents thought that the incomes and job prospects of Middle Australians were rising or falling. In 1996, 2/3 of our respondents said that income and job prospects were falling. This is in the middle of an economic boom. And strikingly, as the economy got further and further into high gear, the number of people saying that wage and salary earners were the losers from economic reform rose by some 13 percentage points to 70% in the year 2000. All the studies show, it's always a bold claim, let's hang with it. All the studies show that people do not think this distribution is fair. Successive national surveys show that the proportion of Australians who thought that income differences were too large has grown from 62% in 1984 to 84% in 2003. In reviewing these and other findings of the 2005 OSA survey, Nick Turnbull and I were struck by the unwavering 2/3 majority support that Australians give to the award and arbitration system, which they see as the fairest way of setting levels of pay. Here specifically, with respect to the distribution of power and income, we see manifest a reaffirmation of an enduring, historically conditioned preference for the same bedrock structure of power and income distribution that was set in place at Federation and which has ever since defined the political economy of our nation. Well, now to some preliminary conclusions. Conclusions on the prospects for a resumption of nation building. First of all, there's the obvious point that nothing can happen unless governments can make it happen. And here the news is probably good. Canberra has demonstrated that it can call up massive reserves of power to change the course of national development. In the wake of these changes, it's likely that government has less leverage over wages and monetary policy and less room in which to moderate the demands of the corporate sector, but we do have ample revenues and probably a hugely more efficient Canberra administrative apparatus with a freshly demonstrated capacity to deal coherently with the immense complexity of modern government. The aim of a 25-year-long top-down neoliberal re-engineering of a whole nation society was always to drive the markets ever more deeply into the fine grain of daily life as a denominator of value and as an automated code for all significant life decisions. The market was meant to bury deliberative politics, to reduce popular expectations of government, to redefine politics as economic management tout court, and to neutralise moral cultures. To use Francis Fukuyama's phrase, it was meant to bring us to the end of history and even to kill the shaping influences of memory and history in national politics. Had it succeeded, Australia would feel more like Singapore and the nation would be dead as a motive force in our lives. But thankfully it's not succeeded. A certain pragmatic utilitarianism is still actively shaping our will and imagination, our intuitions and value judgments about fairness and about what progress and national development should mean, and we care about it. With 4 final points, I hope to persuade you that the changed nature of the challenges we face in the future may come to the rescue of our nation-building past. Cross fingers and touch wood, or do any of those things, please. Firstly, it is likely that a constructive adaptation, Richard Kingsford is here in this audience, the man who might yet have saved the Murray-Darling. Firstly, it's likely that a constructive adaptation to global warming will give rise to structural and cultural changes of a kind that we last saw in the aftermath of World War II. Economic history teaches us that war transforms the relations between economy, political culture and the state. In our case, World War II brought on a permanent concentration of income tax powers at the national level, a still ongoing program of mass immigration of new settlers to our shores, and a spate of iconic nation-building projects like the Snowy River Scheme. Facing up to global warming, we hope, has the potential to resuscitate our national imagination in a similar way. It presents us with challenges that obviously call not only for incremental change at the household level, but also for whole of government action at the national level. Here we need think only of what will be required to bring the Murray-Darling River system back to life in a future of reduced and more variable rainfall. This challenge alone has the potential to break up much of the rusted, stalemated framework of current federal-state relations. Think of the implications not just for the allocation and pricing of water, but also for a whole clutch of related and interconnected changes that will redefine water conservation, forestry management, primary industry and farming practice, and yes, once again, rural and regional development. It even has the potential to heal the tragic gulf that now divides urban from rural Australia. The point is that changes on this scale are likely to burst the limits of routine, pragmatic political accommodation. They force appeals to a latent, collective national imagination and so take on an iconic force that can change motivations and bring people together with an enlarged sense of collective agency and identity. With this could come a restored sense of sovereignty and political agency. Could it? Question mark. So also global warming might give us an opportunity to mobilise power in a way that brings vested interest to heel. More fundamentally, it has the potential to restore the legitimacy of state intervention and to generate the needed cultural energy for nation-building government, those very resources that our economic reformers have tried so hard to erode, and the survey evidence shows that they haven't eroded. It creates spaces in which strangers can more easily recognise each other as citizens of a nation, joined in mutual responsibility for the longer future that they'll bequeath to their own children. One of mine is in this audience. Of course, all this could be so easily sidelined. My point is simply that the challenge of global warming has the potential to produce some very powerful nation-building proteins. A second creative challenge has to do with rebuilding our infrastructure. We're members of the OECD with a per capita national income that's about the same as France. I wonder how long it was since you last caught the very fast train from Montparnasse station. France has a first world national transport and rail network. Ours is not much better than India or at best Malaysia. We have some of the world's most livable cities that have been stressed by bad public transport and the absence of all coherent planning. The same is true at every level of our rundown education system. Ditto for our broadband capacity and for our R&D investments in new technology and value-added quality niche manufacturing. Look out from the breakwater at Newcastle Harbour and you will see, as I did on my last visit there, up to 52 ships waiting to load coal from our hopelessly outdated loading terminals. The point is simply that our infrastructure deficits are huge, glaringly incommensurate with our aspirations as a first world nation, and that now, perhaps for once in a lifetime, we have both the revenue and compelling economic justifications for doing something about it. Huge reconstructions change expectations, create opportunities, and fire up the national imagination. Thirdly, nearly finished, it is a commonplace of political sociology that progressive and modernising social movements, of which the women's movement, the peace movement, and environmental protection are the most notable instances, can only make way in the face of organised political power when entrenched opposing interests are in disarray. My point is that in Australia today, at the level of ideas, only at the level of ideas, the neoliberal opposition to constructive governance and nation building is eclipsed or even exhausted. And even then it can take a comparatively short period of time for ideologies to come undone and for the people to come to their senses. There's a good chance that even Treasury-enforced blind ideological objections to public borrowing could, it's only a possibility, be swept away by renewed political calls for constructive nation building. With the fourth and last point, I come to the prospect about which I care most. My survey of Middle Australian attitudes showed that even 10 years ago, there was no consensus for economic reform, and more to the point, that the broad middle was waking up even then, that more economic reform meant more pressure on families, run-down public health and education services, less job security, more stressful workplaces, urban degradation, uncertain retirement incomes, and probably declining whole-of-life incomes. Later national survey numbers confirm that an increasing proportion of us are seeing, for the first time, that more economic reform also brings reduced standards of living for our children. It's a perfect example of what some people call social learning. Intuitively and ever more consciously, a national population may just be waking up to the truth that a booming economy and increasing GDP means environmental degradation, endangered futures, and falling quality of life. And with that awareness comes a recognition that the economy is not animal, mineral or vegetable, not a thing in itself, but a symbolic construction that comes out of society itself as a political artefact and something that we have the power to change. As that understanding sinks in, a nation can more easily understand for itself that economic rationalism is a perfect irrationality, an ideological concoction, and a form of systematically distorted communication. We see then that we must again understand and use the economy in exactly the same way as our great Nugget Coombs generation of nation builders did, namely as a set of practical instruments for improving the lives of a national and now global population. What is the use of more money, of more economic growth, and of more economic reform if it makes you and the nation poorer? That unsettling question has the potential only, to change both the meaning of money and the priorities of economic policy. We might yet insist anew that governments should make the economy work for the people, not the people for the economy. And I think I hear that bit of the story coming at us like a steam train in a tunnel. Well, here we are at the end. Of course, there are no metaphysical or historical guarantees. Still, I put it to you that the prospects for a resumption of constructive nation building are better than they have been in a long while. Just that. Thank you for your patience, and thank you to so many of my UNSW colleagues, students and friends that have come out this very cold evening to be here. Thank you.